Hey, so get this. Imagine waking up one morning in 1886 on the western frontier. Totally normal day, making breakfast, having no idea that in just a few months you'd be facing the deadliest winter anyone had ever seen. The kind of cold that could freeze you solid before you even realized what was happening. A cold so brutal that cattle would literally freeze, standing up like statues in the snow. Oh, and if you're enjoying these stories, I'd really appreciate a like or subscribe. Super curious where you're all listening from. So, drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. Always blows my mind how people are falling asleep to this all over the world. Alright, find that cozy spot. Take a nice slow breath, and just let your body sink into whatever you're lying on. Tonight, we're going to journey even further back than that deadly frontier winter. Back to the most brutal cold our species has ever faced, the Ice Age. But we're not just talking about surviving the cold. We're talking about surviving each other during the cold. Because if there's one constant throughout human history, it's conflict. And during the Ice Age, conflict took on dimensions we can barely imagine today. Before we dive in, I want you to picture something. Imagine not just fighting for survival against temperatures that could freeze your lungs if you breathed too deeply, but doing it while constantly watching for rival groups who might be desperate enough to kill you for your shelter, your food stores, or simply your furs. Welcome to the wars of the Ice Age, conflicts fought not for ideology or religion or even territory in the way we think of it today, but for the most basic resources needed for immediate survival. The last glacial maximum, around 20,000 years ago, represented the harshest conditions humans have ever endured. Nearly a third of Earth's land surface was covered in ice. Temperatures in some regions averaged 40 degrees colder than today. And in this frozen world, our ancestors didn't just survive, they competed, they fought, and sometimes they went to war. But what exactly do we mean by war in the Ice Age context? We're not talking about standing armies with uniforms and battle standards. We're talking about something more primal, more desperate, and in many ways, more terrifying. Small bands of humans, each possessing specialized knowledge of survival in extreme cold, coming into conflict over hunting territories, shelter locations, or simply the tools needed to process food and create warmth. Archaeological evidence for these conflicts is scattered but compelling. At sites across Europe and Asia, researchers have found human remains dating back 20,000 to 30,000 years, showing clear signs of violent death. Skull fractures consistent with blunt force trauma, stone points embedded in bone, defensive wounds on arm bones raised to ward off attacks. These weren't isolated incidents. They represent a pattern of intergroup violence stretching across millennia. One of the most famous examples comes from Jebel Sahaba in Sudan, dating to around 13,000 years ago as the Ice Age was ending. Here, archaeologists discovered a cemetery containing 59 individuals, and more than half showed evidence of violent death, multiple wounds from projectiles, and hand-to-hand combat. Some individuals had as many as 20 separate injury points on their skeletons. This wasn't random violence. This was organized, purposeful conflict. But to understand Ice Age warfare, we need to understand the stakes. In our modern world, with heating systems in grocery stores and emergency services, it's hard to truly grasp what resource scarcity meant during the Ice Age. We're talking about environments where a single failed hunt could mean starvation, where shelter locations with the right combination of protection from wind, access to water, and defensibility could mean the difference between life and death. When your entire existence balances on such a knife edge, the calculus of violence changes. Modern hunter-gatherer groups typically avoid violent conflict when possible. It's simply too costly in terms of risk to valuable group members. But the extreme conditions of the Ice Age likely pushed many groups beyond this calculation, to points where violence became a desperate necessity rather than a choice to be avoided. The weapons of Ice Age conflict tell their own story. This wasn't the era of metal and mass production. Every weapon represented hours or days of painstaking work, often using materials that were themselves scarce and valuable. Stone spear, points knapped with incredible precision. Bone atlatls that could launch projectiles with devastating force. Clubs carved from mammoth ivory, a material that combined tremendous weight with surprising resilience. At sites like Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic, dating to about 29,000 years ago, archaeologists have found specialized projectile points that seem designed specifically for penetrating human targets rather than hunting game. The points are smaller, designed for speed and penetration rather than the stopping power needed for large animals. This suggests deliberate preparation for human conflict, not just adaptation of hunting tools for emergency defense. But the most terrifying weapons of the Ice Age may have been cognitive rather than physical. Evidence suggests that by this period, humans had developed sophisticated tactical thinking, the ability to coordinate group actions, to plan ambushes, to use terrain to advantage. Imagine facing not just the physical threat of another desperate group, but the calculated strategy of minds equally adapted to survival in the most extreme environments imaginable. Some sites show evidence of what appear to be defensive fortifications, strategic placement of bones or stones to channel approaches to encampments, lookout positions with clear views of surrounding terrain, shelters positioned to protect against both environmental threats and human attackers. At Předměstí in the Czech Republic, dating to about 27,000 years ago, researchers found what appears to be a deliberately constructed barrier of mammoth bones protecting an encampment on one side, the side most vulnerable to human approach. The toll of these conflicts must have been devastating for the small, interdependent groups that characterized Ice Age societies. Every adult represented irreplaceable survival knowledge, specialized skills developed over decades of experience. Every child represented the group's future, carrying genetic adaptations to cold that had been refined over countless generations. The loss of even a few individuals could doom an entire group, not just diminishing their numbers, but creating gaps in their collective knowledge that might prove fatal when the next extreme cold snap hit. Yet despite these incredibly high stakes, evidence suggests that outright warfare was probably intermittent rather than constant. Most groups likely developed sophisticated systems for avoiding conflict when possible. Territorial markers, communication protocols, possibly even trade relationships that created mutual dependency and reduced incentives for attack. At sites across Europe, archaeologists have found objects made from materials that originated hundreds of miles away, suggesting long-distance trade networks operating even during the coldest periods. Seashells from the Mediterranean appearing in Central European sites. Distinctive flint types moving between distant regions. Amber from the Baltic found deep in what is now Ukraine. These weren't just pretty curiosities. They represented tangible evidence of intergroup contact that wasn't characterized by violence. These trade relationships likely served as crucial conflict prevention mechanisms. When two groups establish material exchanges, they create shared interests in each other's survival. A neighboring group you regularly trade with is suddenly worth more alive than dead, their specialized knowledge and access to unique resources becoming assets rather than threats. But these peaceful arrangements could collapse quickly when resources became critically scarce. Ice core data from Greenland shows that the climate during the last ice age wasn't consistently cold. It fluctuated dramatically, sometimes warming significantly for decades or centuries before plunging back into extreme cold. These rapid climate shifts would have played havoc with established territorial arrangements and resource-sharing systems. Imagine a group that spent generations specializing in hunting reindeer along their predictable migration routes, suddenly facing a century where the reindeer no longer appear. Their entire survival strategy, their specialized tools, their preserving techniques, their clothing designs optimized for that specific lifestyle, becomes useless almost overnight. Their choices would be stark: adapt immediately, move into new territories, or perish. And when moving into new territories meant encroaching on another group's survival resources, conflict became almost inevitable. Archaeological evidence suggests these periods of climate instability correlate with increased signs of violent death and defensive fortifications. It's during these transition periods that we find the clearest evidence of organized conflict, not during the stable cold periods when groups had adapted to consistent conditions, but during the chaotic shifts when all previous arrangements became unreliable. The most successful groups appear to have been those that developed dual expertise, both the specialized knowledge needed for extreme cold survival and the adaptive flexibility to change strategies when conditions shifted. This combination, specialization with adaptability, may have been the most valuable survival trait of all, more important even than physical strength or weapon technology. We see evidence of this dual capacity in the archaeological record through sites that show multiple occupation layers with different tool types and subsistence strategies in each layer. Yet, continuity in certain cultural markers suggesting the same group adapting rather than being replaced by newcomers. At the famous site of Kostenki in Russia, researchers have found evidence of a single cultural tradition adapting its subsistence strategies multiple times as climate conditions shifted over thousands of years. But adaptation wasn't always possible, especially when climate shifts happened within a single generation. In these cases, migration became the only viable option, and migration, almost inevitably, meant conflict. The archaeological record shows clear evidence of population movements during particularly severe cold periods, with distinctive cultural markers appearing suddenly in new regions, often accompanied by signs of violent conflict with previous inhabitants. One particularly fascinating aspect of Ice Age conflict is the evidence for what appeared to be ritualized conflict resolution mechanisms. At several sites, archaeologists have found what seem to be specialized spaces for intergroup gatherings, large cleared areas with evidence of temporary shelters, shared feasting, and ceremonial activities. These may represent early examples of diplomacy, neutral grounds where rival groups could gather to resolve disputes without resorting to outright warfare. The famous cave paintings that date to this period may have played a role in these diplomatic processes. Many show not just the animals that were crucial for survival, but what appear to be territorial markers, symbolic representations of group identity, and narrative scenes that might have recorded important events, including conflicts and their resolution. These weren't just art for art's sake. They were sophisticated communication systems, preserving crucial information across generations. Some researchers have suggested that the elaborate burial practices that emerged during this period may also relate to intergroup politics. Burials with extraordinarily rich grave goods, like the famous Sungir burials in Russia, where individuals were interred with thousands of ivory beads representing years of labor, may have served as public demonstrations of group prosperity and power, signals to potential rivals about the consequences of conflict. The gender dynamics of Ice Age conflict present another fascinating angle. While modern stereotypes might suggest warfare was exclusively male territory, the archaeological evidence tells a more complex story. At several sites, female remains show combat injuries similar to those found in males, suggesting direct participation in conflicts. Other evidence points to specialized gender roles in conflict. Males perhaps more often engaged in direct combat, females in defensive roles protecting crucial resources and knowledge. This makes perfect sense when you consider the survival reality of Ice Age groups. In such small bands where every individual represented irreplaceable knowledge and capability, rigid gender exclusion from crucial activities would have been a luxury no group could afford. Everyone needed to be capable of defending the group when necessary, just as everyone needed basic competence in firemaking, shelter construction, and food acquisition. The psychological impact of living under this constant dual threat, extreme environmental conditions, and potential human conflict must have been intense. Modern studies of populations in conflict zones show elevated rates of what we now recognize as PTSD, depression, and anxiety. Ice Age humans would have faced these same psychological challenges without any of our modern understanding of mental health or trauma. Yet, they clearly developed coping mechanisms. The rich spiritual life evidenced by Ice Age artifacts, Carefully crafted figurines, elaborate cave paintings, musical instruments, ceremonial burials suggests communities that maintained cultural practices specifically designed to create psychological resilience. These weren't luxuries separate from survival. They were essential components of a survival strategy that had to address mental well-being alongside physical needs. The famous Venus figurines found across Ice Age Europe may represent one element of these psychological coping systems. While their exact purpose remains debated, many scholars believe they served ritual functions related to fertility, abundance, and continuity, precisely the concerns that would be most pressing for groups facing both environmental threat and human conflict. Similarly, the evidence for music during this period, bone flutes found at sites across Europe, some dating back more than 40,000 years, suggests communities that understood the psychological value of shared cultural experiences. Modern research confirms what our ancestors apparently knew intuitively. Music can reduce stress hormones, increase production of endorphins, and strengthen social bonds, all crucial benefits for groups under constant threat. As the Ice Age began to wane around 700 years ago, the nature of human conflict transformed alongside the warming climate. As forests replaced tundra across much of Europe and Asia, as sea levels rose flooding coastal plains that had been prime habitation zones, and as animal populations shifted in both composition and distribution, the resource competition that had driven Ice Age conflicts evolved into new forms. In some regions, particularly the Near East, evidence suggests increased conflict intensity as formerly mobile groups became more sedentary, investing in fixed locations and accumulated resources that were both more valuable and more difficult to abandon when threatened. The famous site of Jericho, with its massive stone walls dating to around 10,000 years ago, represents one of the earliest examples of large-scale defensive architecture, a response to conflict threats very different from the mobile, adaptive strategies of deep Ice Age groups. In other regions, the warming climate appears to have reduced conflict intensity, at least temporarily. As resources became more abundant and predictable, as formerly uninhabitable zones opened for settlement, relieving population pressure, some areas show reduced evidence of violent death and defensive fortifications. This wasn't universal or permanent. Conflict would return with new intensity as agricultural societies developed, but it suggests the direct relationship between environmental stress and human conflict that characterized the Ice Age. What lessons can we take from these ancient conflicts? First, that human violence has deep roots but is not inevitable. It emerges most consistently in contexts of resource scarcity and environmental stress. Second, that the most successful survival strategies have always balanced individual capability with group cooperation. Lone wolves didn't survive the Ice Age, but neither did groups that couldn't adapt when conditions changed. And third, that our capacity for both extraordinary violence and remarkable cooperation has been shaped by these ancient struggles, leaving us with behavioral instincts adapted for conditions most of us will never experience. Perhaps the most sobering lesson is how thin the veneer of security truly is. Our ancestors lived with constant awareness that survival was never guaranteed, that both environmental conditions and human rivals could destroy everything they'd built in moments. Modern life insulates us from this awareness most of the time. But as recent climate events and conflicts remind us, the fundamental calculus hasn't changed as much as we might like to believe. But there's hope in this ancient story too. If our ancestors could develop sophisticated conflict avoidance strategies, could create art and music and spiritual meaning even while fighting for basic survival, could maintain trade networks stretching across hundreds of miles in a world without maps or written language, then perhaps our own capacity for solving seemingly intractable problems is greater than we sometimes believe. The Ice Age wasn't just a climate event. It was a crucible that shaped human cognition, social structures, and adaptive capacity. The conflicts fought during this period weren't just tragic episodes of violence. They were selection pressures that favored groups capable of balancing competition with cooperation, immediate response with long-term planning. specialized knowledge with adaptive flexibility. We are the descendants of the survivors, not just those who endured the cold, but those who navigated the complex social challenges of a world where every resource was precious and every decision carried life or death consequences. That legacy lives in our instinctive responses to threat, our capacity for both violence and extraordinary cooperation, our ability to create meaning even in the darkest circumstances. So next time you hear about climate change or resource conflicts or refugee crises, remember that these challenges have deep roots in our species' history. We've faced versions of them before, in conditions far more extreme than anything in the modern world. That doesn't make current problems less serious, but it might give us perspective on our capacity to address them. If we can draw on the same combination of innovation, cooperation, and meaning-making that allowed our ancestors to survive the frozen battlefields of the Ice Age. If you're finding this interesting, I'd really appreciate a like or subscribe. Let me know in the comments what aspect of ancient survival you'd like to hear about next, whether it's specific survival technologies, particular conflict patterns, or the psychological adaptations that made it all possible. And as always, I'm curious where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, let's dive deeper into some of the specific evidence for Ice Age conflicts, because the archaeological record tells a fascinating and sometimes disturbing story of how our ancestors fought for survival against both the elements and each other. One of the most remarkable sites is Sungir in Russia, dating to about 30,000 years ago. Here, archaeologists found several elaborate burials including 2 adolescents and an older adult. What makes these burials particularly interesting from a conflict perspective is not just their extraordinary richness, thousands of ivory beads, jewelry, and weapons, but specific details that suggest a society familiar with violence. The male adolescent was buried with what appears to be a ritual killing device, a spear point placed near his neck in a position suggesting symbolic throat cutting. The adult male showed healed fractures consistent with combat injuries. Perhaps most tellingly, the grave goods included multiple spears and daggers clearly designed for human combat, rather than hunting, smaller, more precisely crafted, and optimized for speed, rather than stopping power. These weren't just practical tools, they were status symbols, indicators of both individual combat capability and group martial power. The incredible labor investment represented by these artifacts, each ivory bead requiring 45-60 minutes to create, with thousands included in a single burial, suggests a society that placed enormous value on martial prowess and was willing to commit substantial resources to its development and display. Another crucial site is Krpina in Croatia, where remains of at least 23 Neanderthal individuals dating to around 130,000 years ago show clear evidence of violent conflict. While technically predating what we consider the last Ice Age, this site provides important context for understanding the deep roots of cold climate conflict. The remains show multiple healed fractures consistent with combat, cut marks suggesting deliberate defleshing, and positioning that indicates intentional disposal rather than ceremonial burial. While the exact interpretation remains debated, some researchers suggest these might represent cannibalism rather than intergroup warfare. The evidence clearly indicates violent interaction between individuals. Whether this represents conflict within a group or between distinct groups, it demonstrates that violence was an established pattern long before modern humans faced the extreme conditions of the last glacial maximum. At the site of Vogelherde in Germany, dating to about 35,000 years ago, archaeologists found human remains with embedded projectile points, clear evidence of violent death. What makes this site particularly interesting is the sophistication of the weapons involved. The points show evidence of complex composite construction, stone tips attached to wooden shafts with precisely prepared adhesives made from tree resin and beeswax, the whole assembly carefully balanced for accuracy over distance. These weren't crude implements but highly engineered weapons requiring substantial knowledge and preparation. The investment represented by these artifacts suggests societies that placed high value on combat capability and were willing to dedicate significant resources to maintaining technological advantage over potential rivals. Perhaps the most dramatic evidence comes from Masika Cave in Poland, dating to about 15,000 years ago. Here, archaeologists found the remains of at least 16 individuals who appear to have been massacred in a single event. The bones show cut marks from stone tools, evidence of deliberate breaking to extract marrow, and positioning suggesting the bodies were processed where they fell rather than being moved or buried. This wasn't random violence. This appears to have been a deliberate attack on an entire group, possibly aimed at eliminating competition for scarce resources during a particularly harsh period. The thoroughness of the attack, including elderly individuals and children, suggests not just conflict over immediate resources, but potentially a strategy of eliminating rival groups entirely. What's particularly chilling about the Masika evidence is the technical sophistication it reveals. The attack appears to have been carefully planned and executed, with the victims likely surprised in their shelter, possibly while sleeping. This wasn't primitive rage but calculated violence designed to eliminate competition with minimal risk to the attackers, evidence of cognitive capabilities and strategic thinking fully equal to our own. The weapons used in these ancient conflicts deserve special attention, because they reveal both the technical sophistication of Ice Age societies and the specific challenges of cold climate warfare. The spear thrower or atlatl, found at sites dating back at least 30,000 years, effectively doubled the force with which a spear could be thrown. This wasn't just a minor improvement, but a revolutionary technology that dramatically increased the lethal range of human hunters and warriors. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated that a skilled user with an atlatl can launch a projectile with enough force to penetrate modern protective gear at distances up to 40 meters. In the context of Ice Age conflict, this would have created a significant advantage for groups that possess this technology and the skill to use it effectively. Similarly, the compound bow, which appears in the archaeological record around 20,000 years ago, represented another revolutionary advancement. By storing energy in both the bow limbs and the string, this design dramatically increased both power and accuracy compared to simple bows. In cold environments where thick furs and multiple clothing layers provided natural armor, this increased penetrating power would have been particularly valuable in conflict situations. But Ice Age warfare wasn't limited to ranged weapons. Evidence from multiple sites shows sophisticated hand-to-hand combat implements, including clubs, daggers, and what appear to be specialized fighting picks designed to penetrate skull bones. At the famous site of Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic, archaeologists found a carved ivory baton that shows signs of impact damage consistent with use as a close combat weapon. What's particularly interesting about these melee weapons is their dual-purpose design. Many show evidence of use both as tools and as weapons, suggesting societies that had to balance specialized combat effectiveness with practical utility for everyday survival tasks. This dual functionality makes perfect sense in a context where every carried item represented weight and where specialized combat might be necessary, but wasn't a daily activity. The defensive technologies of Ice Age conflict are harder to identify in the archaeological record, but no less fascinating. While we don't find metal armor or shields, evidence suggests sophisticated use of leather and fur garments that would have provided significant protection against both environmental threats and human weapons. Experimental archaeology using replica Ice Age weapons against layered fur and leather garments has demonstrated that properly prepared animal skins can provide substantial protection against both cutting and impact damage. A typical cold weather garment with multiple layers of fur and hide would have served as effective armor against many of the weapons available during this period. More subtle defensive technologies appear in site selection and shelter construction. Many Ice Age encampments show evidence of strategic positioning with clear fields of view, limited approach paths that could be easily monitored, and proximity to escape routes or defensive terrain features. Shelter entrances often face away from the prevailing wind, not just for environmental protection, but potentially to reduce noise interference that might mask the approach of threats. At several sites, archaeologists have found evidence of what appear to be early warning systems, Stone platforms positioned at a distance from main encampments, with clear sightlines and evidence of fire use, suggesting lookout positions that could alert the main group to approaching threats, whether human or animal. The tactical thinking revealed by these site arrangements demonstrates sophisticated understanding of both terrain advantages and human movement patterns. These weren't random choices but calculated decisions balancing multiple survival factors, including defensibility against human threats. But perhaps the most effective defensive technology developed during the Ice Age wasn't physical at all, but social. Evidence suggests that many groups developed sophisticated systems for avoiding conflict through territorial marking, communication protocols, and alliance formation. At numerous cave sites across Europe, archaeologists have found what appear to be intentional handprints and abstract symbols placed near entrances or at territory boundaries. While their exact meaning remains debated, many researchers believe these served as territorial markers, identifying which group claims specific areas and resources. Similar marking systems are found among modern hunter-gatherer groups, where they help prevent accidental territorial violations that might lead to conflict. More complex communication systems appear in portable art objects found across Ice Age Europe. Small carved pieces, showing distinctive design elements, appear distributed across vast geographical areas, suggesting intentional signaling of group identity and affiliation. These weren't just decorative items but sophisticated communication tools, allowing individuals to identify friend from foe in potential conflict situations. The most advanced defensive strategy evident in the archaeological record involves what appear to be deliberate alliance formations between distinct groups. At several sites, researchers have found burials containing individuals with skeletal features, suggesting different geographic origins, buried together with shared grave goods and ritual elements. These may represent deliberate marriage alliances or other forms of intergroup bonding designed to reduce conflict risk and create mutual defense obligations. This sophisticated social engineering, creating kinship and obligation bonds between potentially rival groups, represents perhaps the most effective conflict management system developed during the Ice Age. By transforming potential enemies into relatives and allies, these arrangements created buffer zones of friendly or neutral territory that reduced direct competition for crucial resources. But these social systems, effective as they were, could break down when environmental conditions changed dramatically. Ice core evidence shows at least 25 major climate fluctuation events during the last Ice Age, periods when average temperatures could change by 10 degrees Celsius or more within a single human lifetime. These weren't gradual shifts allowing for comfortable adaptation but rapid disruptions that would have upended established territorial arrangements and resource-sharing systems almost overnight. During these periods of climate instability, archaeological evidence shows increased signs of violent death, defensive fortifications, and rapid cultural change. Groups that had coexisted peacefully for generations might suddenly find themselves in direct resource competition as traditional hunting grounds became unproductive or migration routes shifted. Former allies could become threats, and previously sustainable population densities could suddenly exceed the carrying capacity of changed environments. What's particularly fascinating is how Ice Age societies appear to have recognized these patterns and developed cultural adaptations to manage them. Evidence suggests many groups maintained what anthropologists call social memory, cultural knowledge preserved across generations about how to respond to dramatic environmental changes they might experience only once every few centuries. This social memory appears encoded in both practical knowledge, maintainable skills for environments the group didn't currently inhabit, but might need to return to, and in spiritual practices, with mythological systems that provided frameworks for understanding and responding to dramatic environmental shifts. The famous cave paintings that often show animals from multiple climate regimes may represent one form of this memory storage, preserving knowledge about species the current generation rarely encountered but their descendants might need to hunt. One particularly intriguing aspect of Ice Age conflict is how it appears to have shaped human cognitive development. The challenges of surviving both environmental extremes and human threats selected strongly for certain cognitive traits: strategic thinking, empathetic understanding of potential rivals, ability to form and maintain complex social alliances, capacity to innovate in response to novel threats. These selection pressures likely contributed to the remarkable brain development that characterizes modern humans. Our oversized neocortex, the brain region responsible for higher cognitive functions including planning, social reasoning, and language, may represent in part an adaptation to the complex social challenges posed by Ice Age survival, including the need to both cooperate with and sometimes defend against other equally intelligent human groups. The language capabilities that emerged during this period would have been particularly valuable in conflict situations. The ability to communicate complex tactical information quickly, to preserve and transmit knowledge about potential threats, to negotiate complex alliance arrangements, all would have provided significant survival advantages to groups facing both environmental and human threats. Evidence for increasingly sophisticated language use appears in multiple forms during this period. The proliferation of symbolic art, suggesting abstract thinking capabilities, the appearance of complex multi-stage technologies requiring detailed instructional transmission, and the evidence for long-distance trade networks all point to language capabilities approaching or equivalent to our own. This cognitive arms race, groups developing increasingly sophisticated strategies for both cooperation and competition, created a powerful feedback loop. As human groups became more dangerous potential threats due to their tactical thinking and weapon technologies, the pressure to develop better defensive strategies and stronger alliance systems increased, which in turn drove further cognitive development. The end result was humans with extraordinary capabilities for both violence and cooperation, able to shift rapidly between competitive and collaborative modes, depending on environmental conditions and resource availability. This cognitive flexibility, the ability to recognize when competition is counterproductive and cooperation essential, may represent the most important adaptation to emerge from the crucible of Ice Age conflict. As the Ice Age drew to a close around 11,700 years ago, these patterns of conflict and cooperation transformed alongside the changing climate. The warming world brought new opportunities, but also new challenges. Forests expanded, creating environments where ambush rather than open pursuit became the dominant hunting and warfare strategy. Rising sea levels flooded coastal plains, forcing migration and creating new resource competitions. Animal populations shifted, rendering specialized hunting knowledge suddenly obsolete and creating pressure to develop new subsistence strategies. In some regions, particularly the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, the warming climate created conditions where plant resources became abundant enough to support semi-sedentary lifestyle. This shift toward fixed settlements created new conflict dynamics. Groups with permanent infrastructure and stored resources suddenly had more to defend and more to lose, driving the development of more formal defensive structures and potentially more organized warfare. The famous site of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, dating to around 9,500 BCE, may represent one response to these changing conflict patterns. This remarkable complex of stone circles with carved pillars appears to have served ceremonial rather than residential purposes, potentially as a neutral meeting ground where rival groups could gather for religious ceremonies and perhaps negotiate resource-sharing arrangements to prevent violent conflict. Similarly, the development of agriculture itself may have been partially driven by conflict pressures. By creating food resources that could be defended and controlled, early farming communities could maintain larger population densities and potentially field more effective defensive forces than mobile hunter-gatherer groups. The transition wasn't smooth or universal. Evidence suggests multiple regions where farmers and hunter-gatherers maintained uneasy coexistence for centuries or millennia, sometimes trading peacefully, sometimes engaging in violent conflict. This complex transition period, neither fully Ice Age nor fully Holocene in climate terms, neither entirely hunter-gatherer nor fully agricultural in subsistence terms, represented perhaps the most dynamic period of human cultural evolution. The adaptive strategies developed during the Ice Age were being applied to rapidly changing conditions, creating extraordinary diversity in how different human groups organized themselves and interacted with others. Some groups appear to have maintained primarily peaceful interactions, developing elaborate trade networks and ceremonial systems for managing potential conflicts. Others developed increasingly hierarchical social structures with specialized warrior classes and more formal territorial control. Both approaches represented valid adaptive strategies to the new post-Ice Age reality, and both drew on the cognitive and social capabilities that had emerged during the frozen conflicts of the glacial period. What's particularly fascinating is how these different approaches interacted and influenced each other. Evidence suggests significant knowledge exchange between farming communities and hunter-gatherer groups, between hierarchical societies and more egalitarian ones. Cultural transmission wasn't unidirectional but complex and multifaceted, with innovations flowing between different social organizations and subsistence strategy. The cognitive flexibility that had evolved during the Ice Age, the ability to recognize when competition was counterproductive and cooperation essential, served human groups well during this transition period. Rather than rigid adherence to single strategies, the archaeological record shows remarkable adaptability, with groups adopting and modifying practices from others when they proved advantageous. This adaptability, the legacy of Ice Age survival pressures, may represent our species' greatest strength. The capacity to shift between competitive and collaborative modes depending on circumstances, to recognize when violence is counterproductive and alliance beneficial, to preserve knowledge while remaining open to innovation. These cognitive traits that emerged in the crucible of Ice Age conflict continue to shape human societies today. As we face our own period of rapid environmental change and resource pressure, these ancient adaptations take on new relevance. The cognitive tools that allowed our ancestors to navigate the extreme challenges of Ice Age conflict, strategic thinking, alliance formation, innovation under pressure, remain available to us. The question is whether we'll apply them with the same effectiveness they did. The ultimate lesson of Ice Age conflict may be both sobering and hopeful. Sobering because it reminds us that resource scarcity has always driven human violence, and we're not exempt from these ancient patterns. Hopeful because it demonstrates our remarkable capacity for adaptation, for finding cooperative solutions even in the most extreme circumstances, for creating meaning and continuity even when facing existential threats. We are the descendants of those who survived not just the cold, but the conflicts it generated. We carry their legacy not just in our DNA, but in our social structures, our cognitive tendencies, our capacity for both extraordinary violence and remarkable cooperation. Understanding this legacy doesn't excuse modern conflicts, but might help us recognize their deeper patterns and perhaps find more effective resolutions. If you're finding this deep dive into ancient conflict patterns interesting, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What aspects of Ice Age survival and warfare fascinate you most? What parallels do you see with modern resource conflicts? As always, I'm curious where you're listening from and what time it is there. For those of you using this to help fall asleep, I'm going to continue for a bit longer with some more detailed exploration of Ice Age conflict evidence and its implications. Just let your mind follow along as we journey further into this fascinating period of human history. One aspect of Ice Age conflict that deserves deeper exploration is the evidence for what appears to be ritual or ceremonial violence. Conflict with symbolic rather than purely practical purposes. At several sites across Europe, archaeologists have found human remains showing evidence of post-mortem modification that goes beyond what would be necessary for practical purposes, like resource extraction. At the famous site of Gough's Cave in England, dating to about 14,700 years ago, researchers found human skulls that had been carefully modified to create drinking vessels. The processing marks show remarkable precision, with specific areas of the skull removed to create functional cups. What makes these particularly interesting is the careful preparation. These weren't hasty battlefield trophies but precisely crafted ritual objects. Similar evidence appears at sites across Europe and Asia, suggesting widespread practices of creating ritual objects from the remains of human rivals. These practices weren't universal. Many Ice Age burials show respectful treatment of the dead with no evidence of modification, but they appear consistently enough to suggest established cultural patterns rather than isolated incidents. What motivated these practices remains debated. Some researchers suggest they represent straightforward trophy-taking, displays of martial prowess meant to intimidate rivals. Others propose more complex spiritual motivations, perhaps attempts to capture the power or knowledge of defeated enemies, to incorporate their strength into the victor's group, or to prevent their spirits from seeking revenge. Whatever their specific meaning, these practices suggest conflict with dimensions beyond simple resource competition. These were societies for which violence had spiritual and symbolic significance, for whom defeating enemies carried meaning beyond the practical advantages of eliminating competition. This symbolic dimension of conflict likely played important roles in group identity formation and maintenance. By creating clear distinctions between us and them, by establishing shared rituals around conflict and its aftermath, these practices would have strengthened internal group cohesion while clarifying boundaries with potential rivals. Modern research in social psychology confirms what our ancestors apparently understood intuitively. Shared threat perception and common enemies are powerful factors in group cohesion. By ritualizing conflict, by creating symbolic representations of victory and defeat, Ice Age societies may have been deliberately engineering their social dynamics to maximize internal cooperation in the face of external threats. These symbolic practices weren't limited to treatment of defeated enemies. Evidence suggests elaborate preparation rituals for hunters and warriors, specialized garments and body decorations associated with conflict, and ceremonial activities before and after violent encounters. The famous cave painting known as The Sorcerer from Trois Frères Cave in France, showing what appears to be a human-animal hybrid figure, has been interpreted by some researchers as representing a ritual specialist associated with hunting or warfare preparation. These weren't just psychological techniques, but sophisticated social technologies designed to manage the extreme stress of survival under dual threats from environment and human rivals. By creating ritual frameworks for understanding and processing violent events, these societies developed psychological resilience that would have been crucial for maintaining functional groups under constant pressure. The social consequences of Ice Age conflict patterns extend far beyond the immediate impact of violence. Evidence suggests these ancient competition patterns may have shaped fundamental aspects of human social organization that persist today, including gender roles, leadership structures, and status hierarchies. At several Ice Age sites, researchers have found what appear to be specialized male burials with distinctive weapons and combat-associated injuries, suggesting emerging warrior identities and perhaps specialized combat roles within groups. At the same time, female burials from this period often show different but equally valued specialization, evidence of expertise in crucial survival technologies like clothing production, food processing, and medicinal knowledge. These patterns suggest early differentiation of gender roles, potentially influenced by conflict pressures, but not necessarily the rigid hierarchies that would emerge in later agricultural societies. Ice Age groups appear to have maintained relatively egalitarian structures, where different specializations carried similar status, a pattern that makes perfect sense in small interdependent groups, where every member's survival knowledge was crucial. Leadership structures during this period appear similarly fluid and context-dependent. Evidence suggests situational leadership rather than permanent hierarchies, different individuals taking primary roles based on specific challenges and their relevant expertise. This pattern remains visible in many modern hunter-gatherer groups, where hunting leaders might differ from diplomatic leaders or spiritual specialists, with authority limited to specific domains rather than extending across all group activities. This flexible, expertise-based leadership would have been particularly adaptive in the rapidly changing conditions of the Ice Age, allowing groups to quickly reorganize around different skill sets as challenges shifted from environmental survival to intergroup conflict to diplomatic negotiation. Rather than rigid hierarchies that might become maladaptive when conditions changed, these fluid structures allowed rapid reconfiguration as needed. Status within these groups appears to have been based primarily on contribution to group survival, rather than accumulated wealth or inherited position. Burial evidence shows respect and elaborate treatment for individuals with specialized skills, expert toolmakers, successful hunters, skilled healers, regardless of age or apparent kinship connections. This meritocratic approach would have created strong incentives for developing and sharing survival knowledge, crucial in a context where group survival depended on maintaining diverse expertise. These social adaptations, flexible leadership, expertise-based status, and gender specialization without rigid hierarchy likely emerged as responses to the dual pressures of environmental extremes and human conflict. Groups with these characteristics would have been more resilient to both types of challenges, better able to adapt when conditions changed, and more effective at preserving crucial knowledge across generations. As we consider modern social challenges, from political polarization to resource conflicts to climate adaptation, these ancient social technologies take on renewed relevance. The flexibility, contextual leadership, and respect for diverse expertise that characterized Ice Age societies may offer valuable models for addressing contemporary problems that similarly require both specialized knowledge and adaptive capacity. One particularly fascinating aspect of Ice Age conflict is how it appears to have shaped human moral psychology. Our intuitive sense of right and wrong, fairness and unfairness, loyalty and betrayal. The dual pressures of environmental threat and human conflict created selection pressures for specific moral intuitions that continue to influence human societies today. Modern research in moral psychology has identified several core dimensions that appear consistently across human cultures: care, harm, fairness, cheating, loyalty betrayal, authority subversion, and purity degradation. These moral foundations show remarkable consistency across diverse human societies, suggesting deep evolutionary roots rather than purely cultural construction. The challenges of Ice Age survival and conflict would have created strong selection pressures for specific configurations of these moral intuitions. Groups that effectively balanced internal cooperation with external defense needed moral systems that simultaneously encouraged care and fairness within the group while justifying harsh treatment of threatening outsiders. They needed strong loyalty norms to prevent defection during crisis periods, respect for contextual authority to enable coordinated action, and purity concepts that might have helped manage disease risks in close quarters. Evidence for these moral systems appears in multiple forms during this period. Burial practices suggesting care for injured or disabled group members indicate strong within-group care norms, even under extreme resource pressure. Trophy-taking and ritual practices involving defeated enemies suggest moral boundaries that distinguished sharply between in-group and out-group. Cave art and portable objects showing consistent symbolic patterns suggest shared normative understanding transmitted across generations. These moral adaptations weren't just psychological curiosities, but crucial survival technologies. By creating shared ethical frameworks that balanced individual and group interests, that distinguish between allies and threats, that establish clear expectations for behavior in different contexts, these systems enabled the extraordinary cooperation that made human survival possible in extreme conditions. The legacy of these adaptations remains visible in modern moral psychology. Studies consistently show that humans across cultures demonstrate both remarkable capacity for altruism toward perceived in-group members and willingness to harm perceived out-group threats. We show strong reciprocity norms, tendency to form coalitions, sensitivity to free riding, and contextual leadership acceptance, all patterns that would have been highly adaptive in Ice Age conflict conditions. Understanding these deep roots of human moral intuitions doesn't excuse modern ethical failures, but might help explain their persistent patterns. The tribal psychology that served our ancestors well in Ice Age conflicts continues to shape our responses to perceived threats and resource competition, sometimes in ways maladapted to modern conditions of global interdependence and technological power. The technological innovations that emerged from Ice Age conflict pressures present another fascinating dimension of this story. The archaeological record shows clear evidence of accelerated technological development during periods of both environmental stress and human competition, suggesting these dual pressures drove innovation in ways that transformed human capabilities. The development of the spear thrower, or atlatl around 30,000 years ago, represented a revolutionary advancement in both hunting and warfare technology. By effectively extending the human arm through a simple mechanical advantage, this device dramatically increased the force with which projectiles could be thrown. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated that skilled users can achieve twice the velocity and 4 times the impact force compared to hand-thrown spears. What makes this innovation particularly interesting is its near-simultaneous appearance across widely separated geographical regions, suggesting either remarkable parallel invention or extremely rapid diffusion. The adaptive advantage it provided, in both hunting dangerous Ice Age fauna and in human conflict, was apparently so significant that the technology spread with extraordinary speed despite limited communication networks. Similar patterns appear with other key innovations from this period. The eyed needle, appearing around 40,000 years ago, transformed clothing technology and, by extension, cold weather survival capability. The compound bow, emerging around 20,000 years ago, revolutionized both hunting and warfare with dramatically increased power and accuracy. Heat treatment of stone tools, appearing around 30,000 years ago, created harder, more durable cutting edges that transformed both practical crafting and weapon effectiveness. These weren't isolated inventions but components of what archaeologists call technological complexes, integrated systems of tools, techniques, and knowledge that work together to solve specific challenges. The Gravettian technological complex of Central and Eastern Europe, for example, represented a sophisticated, integrated system including specialized hunting weapons, hide processing tools, sewing equipment, and shelter construction techniques, all designed to work together in the challenging glacial environment. What's particularly interesting about these technological complexes is how they appear to have spread and diversified. The archaeological record shows clear evidence of core innovations moving between distant groups, being adapted to local conditions and materials, and then developing along independent trajectories. This wasn't simple imitation but creative adaptation, with groups taking useful concepts and modifying them to work in their specific environmental and social context. This pattern, innovation, diffusion, local adaptation, further innovation, created remarkable technological diversity across the Ice Age world. Groups separated by vast distances developed distinct but equally sophisticated survival technologies adapted to their specific challenges, whether Arctic tundra, temperate forests, coastal environments, or high mountain valleys. The cognitive capabilities required for this kind of technological innovation and adaptation are remarkable. Creating effective new tools requires mental simulation, the ability to imagine how a potential design might work without physically creating it first. Adapting observed technologies to new materials or conditions requires analogical thinking, recognizing functional similarities despite surface differences. Improving existing designs requires systematic testing and refinement, essentially an early form of scientific method. These cognitive capabilities, mental simulation, analogical thinking, systematic testing, weren't just useful for technology development. They would have been equally valuable for anticipating rival group behaviors, for developing tactical innovations in conflict situations, for creating diplomatic solutions to resource competition. The same mental tools that allowed our ancestors to develop better spear points would have helped them develop better defensive strategies and alliance arrangements. This connection between technological and social innovation may help explain one of the most remarkable aspects of human evolution: the apparent co-development of technological sophistication and social complexity. Groups with more advanced technologies tended to show evidence of more sophisticated social organization as well, not because one directly caused the other, but because both drew on the same underlying cognitive capabilities. As the Ice Age drew to a close, these innovation patterns accelerated rather than diminished. The warming climate created new challenges and opportunities, driving further technological development in areas like watercraft construction, fishing technologies, plant processing tools, and eventually early agricultural implements. The cognitive tools developed under the dual pressures of environmental extremes and human conflict proved equally valuable for addressing the challenges of a rapidly changing post-glacial world. This legacy of innovation under pressure remains one of humanity's most valuable adaptations. The capacity to develop creative solutions when facing existential threats, to share knowledge across groups despite potential rivalry, to adapt observed technologies to new conditions. These capabilities transformed human existence during the Ice Age and continue to shape our response to modern challenges. As we face our own period of rapid environmental change and resource pressure, these ancient innovation patterns take on renewed relevance. The cognitive tools that allowed our ancestors to survive both glacial conditions and human conflict, mental simulation, analogical thinking, systematic testing, knowledge sharing across potential rival groups, remain essential for addressing contemporary challenges from climate change to resource depletion to international conflict. The communication systems that developed during the Ice Age represent another fascinating dimension of this story. In a world without writing, without electronic transmission, without even reliable long-distance visual signaling due to weather conditions, how did our ancestors coordinate complex activities, preserve crucial knowledge, and maintain contact between distant groups? Archaeological evidence suggests sophisticated solutions to these communication challenges. The cave paintings found throughout Ice Age Europe appear to have served as knowledge storage systems, preserving information about animal behavior, hunting techniques, territorial boundaries, and possibly group histories across generations. These weren't just decorative art, but functional information systems using visual imagery to encode complex knowledge in memorable forms. Similarly, the portable art objects found throughout this period, carved figurines, decorated tools, beads, and pendants with consistent design elements, appear to have served as both group identity markers and potentially as mnemonic devices, physical objects that triggered recall of associated information. Modern memory experts still use similar techniques, associating information with distinctive visual imagery to improve recall. The distribution patterns of these objects suggest intentional information sharing between distant groups. Distinctive design elements appearing across vast geographical areas indicate either direct contact or chain transmission through intermediate groups. These weren't random aesthetic similarities but deliberate signaling systems allowing groups to recognize potential allies, trading partners, or relatives even when encountering them after long separation. Perhaps most remarkably, the archaeological record suggests what appear to be deliberate information caches, collections of tools, materials, and symbolic objects placed in protected locations, possibly intended as resources for future generations, or for group members returning to areas after temporary abandonment. These caches represent a sophisticated understanding of both material preservation and knowledge transmission across time. These communication systems would have been particularly crucial during conflict periods. The ability to recognize friendly versus hostile groups quickly, to transmit warnings about territorial violations or resource threats, to coordinate defensive responses across distributed populations, all would have provided significant survival advantages in a world where human rivals presented dangers equal to environmental threats. The linguistic capabilities that developed alongside these visual communication systems must have been equally sophisticated. While language leaves no direct archaeological trace, the complexity of the technologies and social arrangements evident from this period would have required nuanced verbal communication, discussions of tactical options, negotiations over resource sharing, transmission of detailed technical knowledge, preservation of historical information about past conflicts and alliances. The capacity for narrative thinking, organizing events into coherent stories with causal relationships and moral implications, likely developed significantly during this period. Modern hunter-gatherer groups use sophisticated narrative structures to preserve historical knowledge, transmit ethical principles, and maintain group identity across generations. The challenges of Ice Age survival and conflict would have created strong selection pressures for similar narrative capabilities. These narrative systems wouldn't have been just entertainment, but crucial survival technologies. Stories about successful hunting strategies, effective defensive tactics, reliable alliance partners, or dangerous rival groups would have preserved life-saving information across generations in forms that were both memorable and meaningful. By embedding practical knowledge in narrative structures with emotional resonance, these systems ensured crucial information survived even when specific individuals did not. The spiritual dimensions of these narrative systems deserve particular attention. Evidence suggests Ice Age groups developed complex cosmological understandings, beliefs about the nature of reality, the relationship between humans and animals, the significance of environmental events, and the existence of non-physical beings or forces. These weren't primitive superstitions but sophisticated meaning systems that helped make sense of a challenging and often terrifying world. Cave paintings showing what appear to be therianthropes, beings combining human and animal features, suggest complex ideas about the relationship between humans and other species. Burial practices indicating belief in an afterlife or ongoing spiritual existence suggest cosmological thinking extended beyond immediate physical reality. Ritual objects showing consistent symbolic patterns across vast areas suggest shared spiritual concepts transmitted between distant groups. These spiritual systems would have played crucial roles in conflict management. By establishing shared cosmological frameworks between potential rival groups, they created possibilities for finding common ground despite resource competition. By providing explanatory models for environmental changes and human conflicts, they helped make sense of otherwise chaotic and terrifying experiences. By offering ritualized methods for resolving disputes, they provided alternatives to direct violence when resource competition emerged. The persistence of these communication and meaning systems across millennia suggests their extraordinary effectiveness. Unlike modern information technologies that become obsolete within decades or even years, these Ice Age communication systems maintain functional continuity for thousands of years, preserving crucial survival knowledge across countless generations despite lacking any physical recording technology beyond the objects themselves. This remarkable stability didn't indicate stagnation, but rather a dynamic balance between preservation and adaptation. Core symbolic elements and narrative structures showed continuity across vast timeframes, while specific applications and interpretations evolved as environmental conditions and social arrangements changed. This wasn't rigid tradition, but functional knowledge transmission, maintaining what remained valuable while adapting what needed to change. As the Ice Age drew to a close around 11,700 years ago, these communication systems faced new challenges and opportunities. The warming climate created new environmental conditions requiring different knowledge bases. Increasing population densities enabled by more abundant resources created more complex social arrangements, requiring new forms of information management. The transition towards sedentism and eventually agriculture created possibilities for physical information storage that hadn't existed for mobile hunter-gatherer groups. The response to these challenges reveals both continuity and innovation. Early agricultural communities maintained many of the symbolic systems and narrative structures developed during the Ice Age, while adapting them to new environmental and social realities. The earliest writing systems, emerging millennia later, drew on symbolic traditions with roots in Ice Age communication patterns. Even modern religious and ethical systems contain elements that can be traced to cosmological concepts developed during the glacial period. This continuity suggests the extraordinary effectiveness of these ancient communication technologies. Despite their apparent simplicity compared to modern information systems, they successfully preserved crucial knowledge across thousands of years and countless generations, enabling human survival through environmental conditions and social challenges that would otherwise have been insurmountable. As we face our own information management challenges in the digital age, from misinformation spread to institutional knowledge loss to information overload, these ancient systems offer valuable insights. The integration of practical knowledge with emotional resonance, the use of multiple reinforcing channels, including visual imagery and narrative structure, the balance between preservation and adaptation. These principles remain relevant despite the technological gulf separating us from our Ice Age ancestors. If you're still with me on this deep dive into Ice Age survival and conflict, I appreciate your interest in these ancient stories. As always, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What aspects of Ice Age communication and knowledge preservation do you find most fascinating? What parallels do you see with modern information challenges? And I'm always curious where you're listening from and what time it is there. For those using this to help fall asleep, I'll continue with some final reflections on what these ancient survival patterns might mean for our understanding of human nature and our approach to modern challenges. Just let your mind follow along as we consider the legacy of Ice Age conflict in our contemporary world. One of the most profound insights from studying Ice Age conflict patterns is how they challenge simplistic narratives about human nature. Popular discussions often present false dichotomies: humans as either inherently peaceful or inherently violent, naturally cooperative or naturally competitive, fundamentally altruistic or fundamentally selfish. The archaeological evidence suggests a more complex reality. Our ancestors were capable of both extraordinary cooperation and brutal violence, of remarkable altruism toward group members and harsh treatment of perceived threats, of maintaining peaceful trading relationships for generations and shifting to aggressive competition when resources became critically scarce. This behavioral flexibility, the capacity to shift between cooperative and competitive modes depending on environmental conditions and social context, represents perhaps our most important evolutionary adaptation. Rather than being locked into rigid behavioral patterns, humans developed sophisticated contextual response systems, allowing rapid shifts in social organization and interaction patterns as conditions changed. Modern research in behavioral economics and evolutionary psychology supports this nuanced view. Humans consistently demonstrate what researchers call conditional cooperation, willingness to cooperate when others cooperate, and to punish non-cooperation even at personal cost. We show strong in-group favoritism balanced with capacity for expanding our moral circle when conditions permit. We demonstrate both competitive drive and genuine altruism, often within the same individuals and sometimes within the same interactions. These seemingly contradictory tendencies make perfect sense in light of Ice Age survival pressures. Groups needed members who would compete fiercely for group interests when necessary, but cooperate smoothly when competition was counterproductive. They needed individuals who would defend against outside threats without hesitation, but maintain peaceful trading relationships when mutual benefit was possible. They needed social structures that could shift rapidly between different organizational modes as environmental conditions and resource availability changed. The result was humans with remarkable behavioral range, capable of violence that would shock modern sensibilities and cooperation that would humble the most dedicated altruists. Neither tendency represents our true nature. Both are authentic expressions of adaptive capacities shaped by millennia of survival under the dual pressures of environmental extremes and human conflict. This understanding has profound implications for how we approach modern challenges. If humans are neither inherently peaceful nor inherently violent but conditionally both, then social arrangements that assume either extreme are bound to fail. Systems that ignore our cooperative capacities by assuming pure self-interest will underutilize our greatest strengths. Systems that ignore our competitive tendencies by assuming natural harmony will be vulnerable to predictable disruption. Effective modern institutions need to work with, rather than against these deep patterns, creating conditions that channel competitive drives into productive rather than destructive expressions, while supporting and reinforcing our equally authentic cooperative tendency. The most successful contemporary organizations, whether businesses, governments, or civil society groups, typically balance competitive and cooperative elements rather than exclusively emphasizing either. Similarly, effective approaches to resource conflicts, whether local disputes over water rights or international tensions over energy resources, need to recognize both the competitive aspects of human nature. Purely idealistic approaches that ignore legitimate resource needs and security concerns will fail just as surely as purely cynical approaches that ignore possibilities for mutual benefit and genuine cooperation. The Ice Age experience suggests that humans are most successful when they can maintain this balance, competing when necessary, cooperating when possible, and maintaining the cognitive flexibility to shift between these modes as conditions change. Our ancestors survived the most challenging conditions our species has ever faced, not by being exclusively peaceful or exclusively violent, but by being adaptively both, shifting strategies as environments and social contexts evolve. Perhaps the most important lesson from the Ice Age for our modern world is the value of adaptive diversity. The archaeological record shows remarkable variation in how different human groups responded to similar challenges, diverse technological solutions, varied social arrangements, distinct cultural adaptations, all addressing the same fundamental problems of survival in extreme cold and management of resource competition. This diversity wasn't random but functional. Different approaches worked better in different specific environments, and the exchange of innovations between groups with distinct strategies created possibilities for novel combinations that might outperform either original approach. Rather than converging on a single optimal solution, Ice Age humans maintained a rich ecosystem of survival strategies, each adapted to specific conditions and challenges. Modern approaches to global challenges like climate change, resource depletion, and international conflict might benefit from similar adaptive diversity. Rather than seeking single universal solutions, we might cultivate varied approaches suited to different regional conditions and cultural contexts, while maintaining knowledge exchange systems that allow innovations to spread and recombine. The remarkable resilience of Ice Age humans, their ability to survive both environmental extremes and human conflict, while maintaining cultural continuity and technological development, offers both caution and hope for our modern situation. Caution because it reminds us that resource scarcity has always driven human conflict, and we're not exempt from these ancient patterns. Hope because it demonstrates our remarkable capacity for adaptation, for finding cooperative solutions even in the most extreme circumstances, for creating meaning and continuity even when facing existential threats. We are the descendants of those who survived not just the cold, but the conflicts it generated. We carry their legacy not just in our DNA, but in our social structures, our cognitive tendencies, our capacity for both extraordinary violence and remarkable cooperation. Understanding this legacy doesn't excuse modern conflicts, but might help us recognize their deeper patterns and perhaps find more effective resolutions. So next time you hear simplistic claims about human nature, that we're naturally peaceful or naturally violent, inherently selfish or inherently altruistic, remember the complex reality revealed by our Ice Age ancestors. We are conditionally both, contextually all of these things, and our greatest strength lies not in any single tendency, but in the flexibility to shift between different behavioral modes as challenges and opportunities evolve. This adaptability, the legacy of Ice Age survival pressures, may represent our greatest hope for navigating the complex challenges of our modern world. The capacity to shift between competitive and collaborative modes depending on circumstances, to recognize when violence is counterproductive and alliance beneficial, to preserve knowledge while remaining open to innovation. These cognitive traits that emerged in the crucible of Ice Age conflict continue to shape human societies today and may yet help us create a future worthy of our remarkable evolutionary journey. As you drift towards sleep, Perhaps you can take a moment to appreciate the extraordinary resilience that brought your ancestors through the Ice Age, not just surviving the cold, but navigating the complex social challenges it created. That same resilience lives in you, a legacy of countless generations who faced impossible conditions and found ways to not just endure, but create meaning, beauty, and community, even in the harshest circumstances imaginable. Sleep well, knowing you carry within you the adaptive legacy of these remarkable Ice Age survivors. Good night.